The Falcons are bringing Kentucky quarterback Will Levis in for a visit. Is this due diligence or is there legit interest? We'll break it down on today's Locked On Falcons.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and, of course, the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And we thank every one of you that makes this podcast your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe for free or follow us on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, and you can get the latest episode as soon as it is available. And guys, today we are talking about the Falcons having a top 30 visit with Will Levis of Kentucky. That was reported on Monday. And later in the episode, we'll be joined by Mark Schofield of SB Nation to give his thoughts on Will Levis and the conversation that he and I had over the weekend, where we talked about all the top quarterbacks in this draft class. We talked about Bryce Young on yesterday's episode. We'll talk about CJ Stroud and Anthony Richardson in future episodes, as well as some of the other guys that may not be in the top four a little bit later this week. But let's talk about Will Levis. The fact that the Falcons are visiting with him comes off of the heels of a couple of weeks ago where we learned that they were visiting with Anthony Richardson, one of the other top quarterbacks this year. And the question is whether or not this is due diligence or an indicator of a legit interest from the Atlanta Falcons. And we'll talk about due diligence a little bit later and what that exactly means. But let's talk about why this could be legit interest. And it's because Levis was a player that I personally had identified at the beginning of this offseason process as, if the Falcons were to take a quarterback in round one, Levis probably would be the most likely option for them. And most of that is due to connecting dots based off of their previous interest on other quarterbacks. And we don't necessarily know exactly how much the Falcons love various players, but we have a good idea that they seemingly liked Trey Lance a lot in the 2021 draft. And of course, thought Desmond Ridder was better than at least every other quarterback in that draft class besides Kenny Pickett. And the common strands between Trey Lance and Desmond Ridder, at least from my perspective, is the offense that they run. That both of those offenses incorporate a lot of West Coast principles. The North Dakota State offense under Trey Lance was basically a variation of the West Coast Shanahan style of offense that the Falcons also run. And Cincinnati's offensive coordinator, Mike Denbrock, was a protege of Tyrone Willingham, who was a protege of Dennis Green, who was a protege of Bill Walsh, the originator of the West Coast offense. And so you saw those West Coast principles and Desmond Ridder execute those at a high level in that offense in his final years in Cincinnati. And Will Levis comes from a Kentucky system that also has a lot of West Coast roots. The offensive coordinator in 2021 was Liam Cohen, who was a disciple of Sean McVay. And this past year in 2022 was Rich Scangarello, who is a Shanahan disciple. And not to mention that relative to other quarterbacks potentially available to the Falcons, Levis is probably, at least of the big four guys, the most likely to be available when the Falcons are on the clock at 8. So hearing that the Falcons are at least talking and visiting with Will Levis doesn't surprise me. Now, what I will sit here and say, I don't think the Falcons are going to draft a quarterback this year, guys, right? And that's based off of the fact that they publicly named Desmond Ridder the starter. They signed a backup in Taylor Heineke and made him one of the higher paid backups in the NFL. And the team already has a third quarterback on the roster named Logan Woodside. And in the 800 plus days that Terry Fontenot and Arthur Smith have been on the job here in Atlanta, they have never carried more than 3 quarterbacks on the roster. I don't see any reason, with Desmond Ridder being your starter and the need to get him reps, to add a fourth arm to that mix in order to take reps away from him and others on this team. So I won't say 100%. You can never be 100% on anything, but 98.7% confident that the Falcons are done on the quarterback position. And this more qualifies on due diligence. And what exactly is due diligence? Now, what I think a lot of people assume when they hear that term is, oh, they're just meeting with guys just for S's and G's, as they would say, for no particular reason, just because they can, right? And what people need to be reminded of is the pre-draft process, meaning the time between the end of the college football season and the NFL season and the draft, is really about gathering information. That during the season, the summer and the fall, the scouts are going out and watching the film, talking to coaches, giving their grades. They submit those reports at the end of the season. And now the process from that point on is about how much more information can we add to those reports as much as possible. It's the measurables, it's the athletic testing, it's the medical information. You get to meet the players at the all-star games, at the combine, at the pro day, and for these top 30 visits where you can visit with 30 players and bring them into your building to spend the whole day with them. Some teams do it one player at a time. Some teams just bring a whole bunch of guys into their building all at once. Some teams are looking at guys that they're going to draft. Some teams are just looking at guys that they plan on signing to undrafted free agent contracts. Every team varies, but it's all about gathering information. We know that the Falcons met with all four of the top quarterbacks at the combine, but those are 18-minute interviews. And you can't get much in an 18-minute interview with a quarterback, especially because so much of that position is about what is between the ears, right? You have to meet with these guys. You have to spend a considerable amount of time. And while Desmond Ridder might be the guy this year and probably next year or whatever, we don't necessarily know that. And so the Falcons, it is in their best interest to do as much homework on these quarterbacks as they possibly can. And let's talk about what due diligence exactly means, right? If you go and you Google it, the legal definition of due diligence is reasonable steps taken by a person in order to satisfy a legal requirement, especially in buying or selling something. And the business definition of due diligence is a comprehensive appraisal of a business undertaken by a prospective buyer, especially to establish its assets and liabilities and evaluates its commercial potential. And let's talk about business, because everybody will sit here and tell you that the NFL is a business first. And let's apply that business definition in sports terms. So a comprehensive appraisal of a business, in this case, an NFL prospect is that business, undertaken by a prospective buyer, in this case, an NFL football team, especially to establish its assets and liabilities, in this case, strengths and weaknesses, to evaluate its commercial potential, i.e., can you help us win football games? That's what commercial potential is in this case. So once you understand that definition, you should absolutely understand why the Falcons are doing their due diligence on Will Levis as well as other top quarterbacks, right? And so it's a question of, should they be doing that? Absolutely. The answer should be. We don't know. We can be as confident and hopeful as we want to be with Desmond Ridder, but we do not know if he is our guy. So you might as well shop around, right? You might as well, when you're going to the grocery store, you're looking at the Sargento cheese, or you're looking at the generic cheese, or the expensive cheese, whatever, and you have to make a decision on whether or not you want to buy the expensive cheese or the Sargento cheese or the generic cheese, whatever the case may be. We all do it on a daily basis. And now all of a sudden, when an NFL franchise does it, everybody's going like, oh, what's going on? What is the team doing? So the last point I'll make on this, right, is I think the biggest mistake that your average fan makes when it comes to these types of things, when it comes to the Falcons and other teams showing interest in the player, is that they think this is like, the end all be all, and it's not, right? And this is coming from a person that used to have a very comprehensive draft interest tracker at falfans.com, RIP. But part of the reason why is I think people think that they're gleaning some insight into the Falcons draft board when they see the players that they're interested in. And basically, like, one of the reasons why I don't care as much about draft interest as I once did, because I don't think it's as valuable as a lot of people assume it is, right? And so the other thing that you have to factor in is you don't know exactly what the Falcons get out of this meeting. We don't know their conclusion based off of this meeting with Will Levis. Hypothetically, let's say the Falcons gave Will Levis and Desmond Ridder similar grades, right? And if you go to NFL.com, they actually have similar grades. Desmond Ridder actually grades out slightly higher, according to Lance Zierlein, who does all the scouting reports for NFL.com. But let's say they just want to kind of do an apples to apples comparison between Will Levis and Desmond Ridder, given that they grade out similarly. And so you have to meet with the guy, because we heard for an entire year how Desmond Ridder really sold them by how they met with him, the intangibles, the leadership, the work ethic, the competitiveness, all those various things that some people roll their eyes at, but are legitimate issues that you need to have if you're going to be a successful NFL quarterback. Those were the things that stood out with Desmond Ridder over the course of that pre-draft process. And now you want to see how Will Levis measures up with those things, right? And you can only do that by meeting with the player. You can't do that in an 18-minute combine interview or just sitting down and watching the film. That's what these top 30 visits are really about. And so, the mistake that people are going to make is assuming that the Falcons are going to go into this meeting and come out of this meeting loving Will Levis, or they could be anything on Will Levis. They could be a lot lower on Will Levis. They could love him. Who knows at this point in time? Making any assumptions, I think, is silly at this point in time. And I think people often assume that the teams are only meeting with the players that they already love. And that's not how it works, right? Teams aren't certainly meeting with players that they probably hate, but there are varying degrees of right? Just think back to when you were in third or fourth grade and you're like, I like, this person, but I don't like this, but that whole sort of thing. So I think the conclusion here, guys, is I don't think Will Levis is going to be the pick, but I don't look at this news as some sort of deep meaning, some sort of insight, anything like that. I think the Falcons are just doing their due diligence, aka their homework on another top quarterback in this draft class. So we'll leave the due diligence conversation aside. We'll move and continue our conversation with Mark Schofield of SB Nation. It was part of an hour-long conversation I had with Mark over the weekend about the top 4 quarterbacks in the draft class. We did the Bryce Young breakdown yesterday. We'll continue today with the Will Levis breakdown, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about where the Falcons are in their quarterback process and why I don't believe that they're going to be drafting a quarterback to sort of underline that point to wrap up today's episode. Grand slams, no hitters, double plays are back, guys, and there's no better place to get in on the MLB action than at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back. Even if your first bet doesn't win, all you got to do is go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up and claim your no sweat first bet. And you can bet the spread or the money line, or you can bet a little to win a lot, which is a parlay. And FanDuel has a great parlay builder for baseball where you can combine bets on who's going to get a hit, who's going to hit a homer, who's going to drive in runs. And so that whether it's Austin Riley or Orlando Arcia, you will have a little bit of good action on those players' successes moving forward for the Atlanta Braves. So don't miss your chance for your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you join FanDuel today. Head on over to FanDuel.com/lockedon again to sign up. FanDuel, an official partner of Major League Baseball. So let's talk about Will Levis. Of course, joined by Mark Schofield. And as I said, Will Levis is pretty polarizing, right? You see another impressive physical specimen, the rocket arm, decent enough athleticism, to use his legs and make plays. I don't know if that's going to be necessarily his calling card, but if he needs to tuck it and run and pick up a first down, I think he can do that. And with Levis, it's kind of a tale of two seasons, right? 2021 under Liam Cohen looked very promising. You're like, I'm very curious where this can go. I probably think he probably would have been QB1 had he come out the previous year. A year ago. And then you get 2022 with Rich Scangarello, and we're not going to take shots at Rich Scangarello, but there hasn't been a lot of praise from him in the world.
Right? And what you see on Twitter is even worse in the group chats, as I'm sure Aaron. It's even worse behind the scenes. Not a lot of fans out there for Coach Scangarello.
Yeah, and so it's kind of one of those things, especially if you are inclined to want to buy in on Will Levis, is to basically say, throw out 2022. Right? Didn't have the same talent around him, lost several receivers, several offensive line starters. And if you want to knock Will Levis for his decision-making, which I think is probably the biggest knock on him, it's because he had to sort of carry the team on his back and make plays. But with that notion, some of the questionable decisions, those are bad habits. And then the question for you in the NFL level is, can you break those bad habits? But I think the case for Will Levis is he's going to be normally we think, these college quarterbacks go from a pristine environment in college to a muddy, chopped up environment in the NFL. And I think with Will Levis, it may be the rare instance where that's the opposite occasion, where he's probably going to get more competent play at the wide receiver position, more competent play at the offensive line position. And so you kind of look at, okay, let's go back to 2021, where he had some of those things going for him, and we saw a lot of promise with him. Do you think that's a fair assessment of where we're at with Will Levis?
Oh, 100%. I mean, when we get sort of 3 weeks from now, Thursday night, the team that ultimately drafts him in the first round, because I think that's where this is headed. He's going in the first round. The argument in that conference room is going to be, we're better, right? Our coaching staff is better. Our talent is better. Our offensive line is better. So we can get 2021 Will Levis. Like, we can get that as a rookie. We can do that. That's sort of, we'll be able to fix everything because we're an NFL team, we're an NFL coaching staff, we're an NFL talented roster. And so I think, yeah, absolutely. There's a situation where he's going to go to a better environment than the one he had in 2022, where, you had another coaching change, you had a loss of talent around him up front and at the receiver position. He had an injury he had to sort of fight through. It was a tough situation for him. He's going to a better environment. So I think that certainly helps him. I also think that, unfortunately for Levis, the Carolina trade may have hurt him in a way, because before Carolina came up and it was looking like Carolina was at 9 and they're getting QB4, I thought, if there's a spot where it's going to work, it's probably Carolina, right? You got Frank Reich, you get Josh McCown, you've got, Jim Caldwell, all the talent and coaching staff talent they put around the quarterback position. I thought, all right, well, if Will Levis is going to end up in Carolina, it's going to work. And all my Panthers fans like James Dater over at SBNation.com, who's like, oh God, we're going to get Will Levis. It's a nightmare. I'm like, well, James, it could work because they have such talent around the quarterback position. And they've got, people that have helped develop quarterbacks like Reich and McCown and others. It could work there. Now with Carolina at 1, unless they decide to really shock the world and draft Will Levis first overall, I mean, I guess it could happen. He's going to go somewhere where maybe there isn't that sort of same power and coaching development, quarterback development skill set around the quarterback position. I mean, let's say he goes to the Raiders at 7. I think Josh McDaniels is a great play caller and play designer. I'm not so sure about him from a quarterback development standpoint. He certainly didn't develop Tim Tebow, and I think the jury's probably still out on how he handled Mac Jones, but there's no real proof of concept there. So it would sort of worry me. But very talented, physical specimen. I mean, let's face it, if he doesn't pan out as an NFL quarterback, like, he's going to go into powerlifting or something, because he's got me thinking about putting mayo in the coffee and eating the banana peel, because he's vascular is how Benjamin Solak describes him. And it's a perfect description for him. Like you said, a physical specimen, certainly can rip it. One of the things that I think frustrated me watching him, particularly at the combine, for example, he was trying so hard to make the perfect throw that he was missing things. And you could see he's still sort of working through some things in his mind. His footwork, perhaps it was a function of the multiple coaches, is a mess at times. Like sometimes like one foot's pointed this way, one foot's pointed that way. It's like, we got to get it like this, my friend, or at least closer to that. So that's still a work in progress. So yeah, there's a lot that has to get fixed. But ultimately, like you said, Aaron, it's going to be that Thursday night. Some team's going to be in their draft war room, and it's going to be, we could get him to that. We could get him to 21. We could coach him up, and they'll be able to fix him, and they'll talk themselves into that. And whether that NFL team is able to do it or not will be the bigger question.
Yeah, when I watch Will Levis, like, I see a lot of Drew Lock in him, that sort of volatility.
Yeah.
And it's like, when it's on, it's like, hey, this looks really good. And then, you get like 1/4 of that with Drew Lock, and then you get 3/4 of just terribleness, right? For a lack of a better term. But then you watch Will Levis, and sometimes I watch him and I'm like, this reminds me a little bit of a young Matt Stafford, a little bit, And it's like, Jim Caldwell, I thought when Jim Caldwell came to Detroit, like, you saw Matt Stafford go from, hey, I'm just basically throwing the ball up to Calvin Johnson. And
right. This triple covered. I don't care. It doesn't matter.
That's our
Calvin Johnson, right?
To, the Matt Stafford that we've seen the last couple of years has been one of the top quarterbacks in the league. So I think with Will Levis, he's kind of a project. Another comp that you see a lot of people throw around is Josh Allen from the physical traits. And because Josh Allen kind of had a similar college career where his second to last year, he looked really good. They lost a lot of players the following year, and it went downhill, and everybody was like, I'm out on this guy. And then we saw him get to a stable environment in Buffalo, coached up, playmakers surrounding him, all the things, and he's one of the best quarterbacks in the league. And so, Will Levis, I think for those reasons, is going to be a polarizing prospect. He's going to be a project. He's going to be a gamble, but this is going to be another testament in the ongoing conversation that you and I have had many years. It's nature versus nurture, right? When you get to the guys in the NFL, like you see things in Will Levis's nature that you're a fan of and also not a fan of. But if you believe in the nurture concept that you can put him in the right environment, you can see how this works out for him. Is that fair?
100%. That's perfect. That's perfectly stated. And I think part of the reason he's so polarizing is out of the, say, big four, he's the one that needs the best landing spot the most, right? Like you can look at Stroud, you can look at Young, you can look at Richardson and say, well, regardless of where they end up, they'll probably be successful. It might not be a ceiling type situation for them, but they could still be a good NFL quarterback. When you look at Levis, it's like, man, he's got to get the right spot. He's got to get the right fit. Like he's got to get the right coaching staff around him. Again, that nature versus nurture. He's definitely the sort of nurture prospect of this big four. And so, yeah, that's why I get back to the Carolina argument, because again, it's like you mentioned with Coach Caldwell and all the other, coaches that are going to be in that room around him. It's like, well, if they're out of the picture now, where can he go where you're comfortable in saying he's going to hit his potential in the NFL? It's hard to find that. I know that's weird for a guy sitting in his basement drinking yet another Starburst C4 to say, oh, these NFL coaches don't know what they're doing. But with Levis, you do get that sense that he needs to be in that right fit, that right environment. Now, Indianapolis has taken a long look at him, and they just took yet another look at him. And maybe what we've seen from Shane Steichen, that could be an environment for him. But it definitely seems like he's the quarterback that needs the best landing spot out of these four.
Okay. Yeah. So, of course, guys, thanks Mark Schofield for talking with me about Will Levis. We'll continue the conversation talking about the Falcons quarterback process and why the Falcons aren't as interested in drafting the next superstar quarterback, the next Matt Stafford, as we just discussed with, Mark Schofield, that if you think Will Levis is that type of player, or Josh Allen, if you want to go there, as a lot of people think they should be, and we'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons, guys. But today's episode is brought to you by the Ultimate Football GM, and you've heard me talk about this fun new mobile game. And as we continue to see the Falcons make moves, you guys can put on your GM hat and control every strategic aspect of your favorite football team on Ultimate Football GM by hiring coaches, making trades, navigating through the draft and free agency, going through all the ups and downs of a season. It's all in a challenging and realistic game world. Ultimate Football GM is completely free. It's playable offline, so you can play on the go whenever you want. And the great thing is that we're offering our listeners here on Locked On a 100% free boost to their franchise when they use the promo code Locked On in all caps in the game store. That's Locked On in all caps. So make sure you check it out today. And if you want to download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up in the app stores. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. So wrapping up today's episode, first, I want to thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. Shout out to all my everydayers out there that are checking out this show as their first listen each and every day, all 5 days a week. So want to give you guys a shout out before we continue talking more about the Falcons quarterback process. And I don't think a lot of people truly understand the Falcons quarterback process, because I think a lot of people have this mindset of you have to draft the quarterback first and then build the infrastructure around the quarterback. And the Falcons strategy is to build the infrastructure first and then worry about the quarterback later. And what's interesting about that, and that's gotten a lot of criticism this offseason, as you guys will know, not here on Locked On Falcons, but elsewhere, especially from the mainstream national football media. But, I think what's funny about that to me is, like, when you look at some of the teams that have been so successful in recent years over the last, 4 or 5 years in the NFL, especially when you look at the teams that have gone to and won Super Bowls in that period of time, most of those teams are teams that you would categorize as they built up the infrastructure first and then worried about the quarterback and then plugged the quarterback into a successful infrastructure. The Bengals would probably be the one exception to that, with sort of selecting Joe Burrow being a huge catalyst to get them to, build up their investments. But you look at Kansas City and Philadelphia, Tampa Bay, the Rams, it would be the opposite, where they kind of built up the team, had a strong foundation, and then went and plugged in Patrick Mahomes, went and plugged in Jalen Hurts. You can even go back to Carson Wentz when the Eagles made that move, Tom Brady with Tampa Bay, and of course Matt Stafford with the Rams, and that led to their ultimate success. And that, to me, is the strategy the Falcons are exactly employing. And yet they're going to get criticized because Desmond Ridder is not a true franchise quarterback. That remains to be seen. And so, this rule is that this unspoken rule is that you have to get the franchise quarterback first, even if that formula hasn't been that effective in recent years. And it's not to say that building up the infrastructure and then going into quarterback is guaranteed to be successful. It's just, to me, it's notable that we don't see more people talking about that as a path for success. And to me, a lot of that is due to the revisionist history with a team like the Chiefs, who are the perfect example of a team that built up the infrastructure and then got the quarterback. But the way that the revisionist historians talk about it is like the Kansas City Chiefs were a middling football team. Then they dropped Patrick Mahomes in it and they instantly became a Super Bowl contender. But those people would be forgetting that the Chiefs had 4 consecutive winning seasons before they ever drafted Patrick Mahomes. They went to the playoffs in 3 out of those 4 years. They were the number 2 seed in the season immediately before drafting Patrick Mahomes. And while you can certainly argue that the Chiefs had a middling offense if they didn't have a middling team prior to Patrick Mahomes' arrival, that's not necessarily true, at least if you look at DVOA rankings, right? And their various grades. If you look at the average Chiefs passing offense under Alex Smith for the 5 years that he was the starter, on average, they were a top 10 passing team under Patrick Mahomes. They would basically be the equivalent of what the Eagles were this past year from a passing standpoint with a MVP caliber Jalen Hurts. Not suggesting that Alex Smith was a MVP caliber candidate, but the idea that the Chiefs were like this bad team or anything like that, there was a strong infrastructure there, right? It's like literally dropping Patrick Mahomes into the Eagles situation, or maybe not literally like that, but similarly like that. And so, if you're asking me when it comes to Desmond Ridder, on this spectrum of Alex Smith or Patrick Mahomes, where does he fit? I'm going to certainly probably say he's Alex Smith, right? That's a player that I compared him to last year in the pre-draft process. Now, I feel like Ridder has somewhat outperformed those expectations based off of the limited sample of games that we've seen so far. But we'll just sort of have to see what it looks like with a full season under his belt before we can really come down one way or the other. And a lot of people here, you're comparing him to Alex Smith and just go kind of roll their eyes at that. And I understand that because, again, the way that we talk about this game and the quarterbacks and these teams is the quarterbacks get all the credit for the team's success and all the blame when the team fails, right? And in the case of the Alex Smith-led Chiefs, the fact that they had a limited number of playoff wins and very little success in January relative to their regular season success, a lot of people will blame that, well, because Alex Smith is the pejorative game manager type of quarterback that could not get him over the hump. And the fact that the Chiefs were able to get over the hump multiple times with Patrick Mahomes means that he's going to get all that credit, and we'll just ignore the infrastructure around him. And we never talk about the steps that the Chiefs took to get to that point where they could go from an Alex Smith to a Patrick Mahomes. We just kind of assume retroactively, well, they got Patrick Mahomes, so that's the first step in the process, rather than the reality of the situation where it's like the 4th or 5th step in the process. And so, I think that leads to some of the conversation about the Falcons quarterback situation and several other teams around the league, where I think a lot of people are just looking for shortcuts to basically become the 2019 Chiefs. When you look at the Falcons situation, is they're probably on timeline closer to the 2013 Chiefs. And you look at that specific team, they won 11 games that year. They were a 5 seed. They were 15th in offensive DVOA with an offense primarily led by a strong running game helmed by Jamal Charles. They were 11th in defensive DVOA with some young studs on defense like Eric Berry and Justin Houston, some older veterans like Tamba Hali and Derek Johnson. And of course, that season did not end as well as the Chiefs would have liked, because it was, heartbreaking to blow a 28-point lead to Andrew Luck in the first round of those playoffs. But if you ask me today, would I take that same exact outcome for the Falcons this upcoming season? And let's say instead of blowing a 28-point lead to Andrew Luck, the Falcons are blowing a 28-point lead to Brock Purdy, I would take that. Now, if you ask me on the Saturday or Sunday in January where the Falcons actually blow that 28-point lead, I probably won't, feel as gung-ho to say this was, thumbs up, this was a great year or whatever the case may be. But I think in the bigger picture of things, that is a huge step forward where the Falcons have been the last 5 years. If we got that sort of season, if we were a 5 seed, we made the playoffs, that sort of thing, and dropped the 40 burger in January, and even if we blew that 40 burger, I think that would be a successful year, a very successful year for the Atlanta Falcons. And the reason why we're talking about this on today's episode is because of the idea, going back to what we just talked about with Mark Schofield, the idea that Will Levis is a project, and may have a higher ceiling than certainly an Alex Smith type. When we talk about Desmond Ridder, the same conversation would apply to Anthony Richardson, who we'll talk about with Mark later on this week. And the idea of a project, and to me, those guys are guys, when we talk about projects, it's probably not going to pay off for you until like 3+ years down the road. And so I don't know if it makes sense for the Falcons, given where they are, to get into bed with one of these long-term project quarterbacks like a Richardson, like a Levis, without having, a firmer foundation, a firmer infrastructure around them. And that's something that the Falcons are continuing to build up. And, you contrast those two guys, Levis and Richardson, with Bryce Young and CJ Stroud. And I don't think those guys would qualify as projects. Those are guys that potentially, if you were to land those guys, you could see success sooner versus later. And they may be that Patrick Mahomes type that you can sort of skip a step to get to earlier than necessary. But I think the thing that's holding back the Falcons from going and getting one of those guys is the opportunity cost, to go from 8-1 or 8-2 to get one of those guys. We just saw the Panthers go from 9-1, and they gave up 3 firsts and 2 seconds essentially to get to that spot. And where the Falcons are at in their process, it's just not worth it to give up that many assets that will directly go into strengthening your infrastructure, strengthening your foundation in order to get a quarterback when you're not at that point in your time. And I think, it's certainly fair to wonder and be skeptical. Again, I'm Mr. Skepticism here, whether or not the Falcons will get there. But I think, to me, my philosophy is we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. I'm not going to worry too much about it. As I often say on this podcast, I can only control the things I can control. I cannot control if the Falcons get there, so I'm not going to worry about it all that much. And I really do think the Falcons are in a good spot. They just may be earlier in that process than I think a lot of people would like them to be, but I think they're definitely headed in the right direction. And we'll see if that plays out on the football field on Sunday. Obviously, if they're winning games and making the postseason this upcoming season, which I think is certainly a possibility. I think all of these issues that we're constantly debating about, what are the Falcons doing and why aren't they going after this quarterback and all this stuff, I think immediately go away. So, time will tell. In 9 months, we'll have a clearer picture on, where this team is headed and where they're at. And I just think people just need to be patient and, go with the flow. Just relax, man. Just chill out, find yourself some sunglasses, get a bowl of popcorn or whatever you need to do and relax. So, this won't be the last time. I'm sure we'll be talking about the quarterback and the direction of the team and all this stuff on the podcast. I'm sure we'll have plenty of those conversations over the next 9 months, but that's going to do it for us on today's episode. We'll just leave those for future episodes, and I hope you guys continue to make us your first listen. We'll continue this conversation with Mark Schofield about the quarterback position. Again, I think it's important because one of these guys is going to be a Carolina Panther, so we need to familiarize ourselves with it. And I also think it's important to understand how we evaluate quarterbacks, so that in the future, when the Falcons are legitimately searching for a quarterback, we can look back at what we thought of Will Levis and Anthony Richardson and CJ Stroud and Hendon Hooker and all these other guys, right? And sort of compare and contrast and like, oh, are we really getting a big time guy, or are we just kind of desperate for a quarterback and that sort of thing? So that's all part of this conversation. We'll continue that conversation with Mark Schofield of SB Nation all week long. We'll also be joined by some Falcon fans who talk about non-quarterbacks. Potentially, we'll see. We'll see. I haven't had those conversations yet, but we'll also be talking about some of the other positions that can help to contribute to that infrastructure and some of the players that they're hoping the Falcons are going to be targeting, early in the draft and late in the draft. And we'll get that on as part of your first listen the rest of the week. But in the meantime, continue to make Locked On NFL Scouting with the Draft Dudes your second listen, where Kyle Krabs, Joe Marino are breaking down what it takes to build a successful NFL franchise every single day. Subscribe to Locked On NFL Scouting with the Draft Dudes wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, guys. Your team every day.